final step in getting energy out of our food comes after the Krebs cycle, and it's called the electron transport chain. The purpose of this is to take the energy out of FADH2 and NADH molecules and use that energy to build ATP. So the first step is to bring either an FADH2 or an NADH molecule up to one of these proteins in the electron transport chain. These are proteins that are embedded in the inner mitochondrial membrane, and they act in some ways like an enzyme. They're going to grab the NADH molecule or an FADH2 molecule and tear off the hydrogens. So NADH gets converted back into NAD. It's free to go back over to the Krebs cycle and pick up some more electrons. Now the hydrogen that was taken away from the NADH, it gets torn apart by the protein to a proton, or a hydrogen ion, that gets put into the space, the intermembrane space, and an electron, which we're going to write as E minus to remind you that electrons have a negative charge. The electrons travel down the chain, getting passed from one protein to the next, until they're at the end to the last protein in the electron transport chain. These proteins are called cytochrome proteins. Cyto means cell, chrome means color, and they actually have iron ions enfolded within the protein. The proteins are the right shape just to hold those iron ions in there, because that's where the electrons are going to bind, is onto those iron ions. And they pass the electron from one protein to the next, to the next, and the next, till it gets to the end of the chain. FADH2 can do the same thing. So let's say it drops off its protons and electrons onto the chain. So we end up with some protons building up here in the intermembrane space. Every time one of these drops off something, it can go back over to the Krebs cycle and pick up more. So they actually call these molecules, NAD and FAD, electron carriers, because their job is to transport the electrons over to the electron transport chain. Now, if you notice, there's a couple of problems building up here. First, you get all these protons in this intermembrane space. They're all the same positive charge. They don't want to be there. They don't want to be crowded up. You know, opposite charges attract, like charges repel. But they're trapped between the membrane. But conveniently, there just happens to be an enzyme here that is has a hole through it that's the right shape to allow protons to go through. Now, in this enzyme has active sites for phosphate, a little inorganic phosphate, and ADP. So it has two active sites. These two molecules fit in there, and then using the energy from these protons that flow through the enzyme, as the protons are flowing through, the energy is used to spin that top of that enzyme and squeeze the ADP and phosphate together, dehydrate them, and create ATP. That's the energy molecule that cells wanted to have. So we've successfully converted the energy from NADH and FADH2 into ATP. And in fact, for every one NADH molecule, there's enough energy to manufacture about 3 ATP molecules. And for every FADH2, you can get about 2 ATP molecules. So all of these NADH and FADH2 molecules can be used to produce ATP. Now, if you notice, one problem here that we've ignored is this electrons that are at the end of the electron transport chain. They're stuck there, and if they can't get off of there, the next time something goes to drop off an electron, it's going to be backed up, and just like a traffic jam, it'll stop all the electrons from moving. Well, if they can't drop off their electrons on the electron transport chain, then NADH and FADH2 aren't going to do that, so they're not going to pick up electrons from the Krebs cycle, which means that acetyl-CoA won't break down, no ATP gets produced, and you have to back all the way up and convert the pyruvate, or pyruvic acid, into lactic acid. So we need a chemical to remove the electron from the electron transport chain, and that's where this chemical comes in, oxygen. Oxygen picks up the electrons, picks up the proton that came through the ATP synthase molecule, the ATP synthase protein, and combines them all together to produce water. So that's where water comes from as a waste product during metabolism, and that's why everybody needs oxygen to breathe. With oxygen, we can get way more ATP than we can by doing anaerobic fermentation. So it's no surprise that most organisms on the planet require oxygen. However, there are some differences. Some types of bacteria actually get along, instead of using oxygen, they use probably the next most similar element, which would be sulfur. It's just below oxygen on the periodic table. And using sulfur, they don't produce water. Instead, they produce hydrogen sulfide gas. So there are variations on this cell respiration, but this is the basics of how we take our food and convert it into energy.